Every time a new company raises its first serious money, the paperwork calls it venture capital, and the phrase sounds like it must be as old as banking itself. It is not. As a business term with an address and a letterhead, it dates to February of 1946, to a private office in New York funded with $10 million of a single family's money. The family was the Whitneys. You may know the name from a museum in downtown Manhattan. You may know it from a gymnasium at Yale, or a psychiatric clinic inside a New York hospital, or from the financing behind Gone with the Wind, or from the early ownership papers of Pan American Airways. What almost nobody knows is that these are all the same money. One river of it, rising out of Manhattan streetcars and Standard Oil dividends in the 1880s, split in two by a family war in 1896, doubled by a will read in 1917, and then poured, very deliberately and very quietly, into institutions you still walk past, study in, and invest through today. The Vanderbilts put their name on everything, and are remembered mostly for losing it. The Whitneys did something more interesting. They put their name on almost nothing that made money, and on nearly everything that made reputation, and in doing so they built a kind of power that outlived the fortune itself. So the question this episode asks is not how one family got rich. Plenty of families got rich. The question is how one family converted rich into permanent, into museums and clinics and financial structures still operating a century later, while staying so far outside the public story that most Americans could not tell you a single fact about them. There is a will in this story that punished two children for siding with their own father. There is an art collection that one of the world's great museums refused to accept as a gift. And there is a two-word phrase you have heard 1,000 times whose birth certificate carries this family's name. Stay with me. Here is what the next half hour will actually give you. First, the 1880s, and how a corporate lawyer who had never served a day at sea rebuilt the United States Navy in 4 years, leaving the American steel armor industry standing in the exact shape he ordered. Second, the streetcar machine, and how tens of millions of dollars of paper value, by some contemporary estimates as much as 100 million, was conjured onto Manhattan surface railways through one of the earliest holding companies in American history, and exactly who was left holding that paper when the whole thing collapsed into receivership in 1907. Third, two weddings, one in 1869 and one in 1896, that wired Standard Oil money and Vanderbilt money into a single bloodline, and the family rupture the second one detonated. Fourth, the 1946 experiment that gave venture capital its name, its structure, and its first famous win, which happens to be a can of frozen orange juice you have almost certainly held in your own hand. And fifth, the playbook itself, the specific repeatable moves by which loud money became quiet power, laid out clearly enough that you will recognize them the next time you see them running, because they are still running. A note on sources before we begin. Everything here comes from probate filings, court and investigation records, and the newspapers of the day, and where the numbers conflict, and with fortunes of this size they always conflict, I will give you the range, rather than pretend to a precision the record does not support. William Collins Whitney was born in Conway, Massachusetts in 1841, into a family that was politically connected and locally respected, but nowhere near great wealth. He went to Yale, then to Harvard for law, and then to New York, where he did what ambitious young lawyers of his generation did. He attached himself to reform. Through the 1870s, he served as Corporation Counsel of New York City, the city's own lawyer, and spent years untangling the fraudulent claims left behind by the Tweed Ring, the political machine that had looted the city treasury of sums estimated anywhere from $30 million to $200 million, depending on which auditor you believed. Whitney's office contested claim after claim against the city, and by the estimates published at the time, that work saved New York several $1 million in fraudulent judgments alone. It gave Whitney something more valuable than a fee. It gave him a reputation for cleanliness, banked early the way other men banked gold. Hold on to that, because it is the first move of the playbook, and everything that follows depends on it. A reputation for honesty, established in public at scale before the money arrives, functions like collateral. It lets you borrow trust later, at moments when the underlying facts would not support the loan. The first wedding came in 1869. Whitney married Flora Payne of Cleveland. Her father, Henry B. Payne, would later be elected to the United States Senate from Ohio in 1884 amid allegations aired in the Ohio legislature and the national press, but never proven, that Standard Oil money had purchased the seat. The Ohio legislature actually investigated. The United States Senate declined to pursue it, and the phrase "Standard Oil senator" followed Payne to his grave. Her brother mattered even more. Oliver Hazard Payne was the treasurer of Standard Oil, one of the small circle of men around John D. Rockefeller, who would come in early enough that the dividends alone made him one of the richest men in America. He never married. He was devoted to his sister Flora with an intensity that will bend this entire story before we are done. He paid for houses. He paid for yachts. He treated her children almost as his own. Remember him. In 1885, President Grover Cleveland made Whitney Secretary of the Navy, and the institution he inherited was, by the assessments of its own officers, close to an embarrassment. The fleet was largely wooden hulls left over from the Civil War era, and the comparison that stung most in the papers of the day was with Chile, whose modern protected cruiser Esmeralda, built in a British yard, was said by naval commentators to be capable of standing off the entire American fleet and destroying it at leisure. Whitney had no naval background whatsoever. What he had was a corporate lawyer's understanding of contracts, and he used it. He consolidated the scattered construction bureaus that had been ordering incompatible parts from competing suppliers. He pushed forward the second generation of steel warships, including the battleships that became the Texas and the Maine, and, in the decision with the longest shadow, he insisted that the armor plate and heavy gun forgivings for the new steel warships be manufactured in the United States rather than purchased from European mills like Krupp in Germany or the British firms that dominated the trade. In 1887, his department awarded Bethlehem Iron a contract worth roughly $4.5 million for armor and gun steel, an enormous sum for a single industrial order in that decade, and the effect was exactly what Whitney intended. Bethlehem built forging capacity that had never existed on the continent. Carnegie followed into armor plate a few years later, and the American heavy steel industry acquired, by government demand, a capability the private market had never called for. When Whitney left office in 1889, the so-called New Navy was underway, and an entire industrial capacity had been called into being by the stroke of a contracting pen. A lawyer from Conway had reshaped a permanent arm of the American state in 4 years. He was 47 years old, and he had noticed something. The most profitable place in America to stand was the doorway between public authority and private capital. So he went and stood in it. Through the 1890s, Whitney partnered with a Virginia-born financier named Thomas Fortune Ryan, a man who had arrived in New York nearly penniless, bought a seat on the stock exchange before he was 30, and would die worth well over $100 million. Ryan supplied the market machinery. Whitney supplied the political access and the reform reputation that collateral banked in the Tweed years. Alongside them stood the Philadelphia traction men, Peter Widner and William Elkins, who had already run a version of this game on the streetcars of Philadelphia and Chicago and knew precisely what a municipal franchise was worth when the city council was friendly. Together they built the machine we need to slow down and examine, because it is the engine of everything that follows. When Whitney died in February of 1904, the newspapers guessed at his estate, and the guesses ranged from roughly $20 million to $40 million, alongside a stable of champion thoroughbreds, a box at Saratoga, and one of the grand houses of Fifth Avenue. But the fortune is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the mechanism. Here is the mechanism, in plain language. Take a public asset, add political access, capitalize the combination far beyond its physical worth, sell the paper to the public, and leave before the paper comes due. In 1886, Whitney and Ryan organized the Metropolitan Traction Company, a corporation whose purpose was not to run streetcars, but to own the companies that ran streetcars, an arrangement so novel that historians of American business often describe it as the first, or among the first, holding companies in the country. Ryan himself, years later, described it with a candor that still startles. He called it a great tin box, a container into which securities could be placed, shuffled, and revalued without reference to anything so vulgar as a physical railway. The sequence ran like this. Step 1. The franchises. The right to lay track down a Manhattan street was a public grant awarded by city government, and Whitney's political relationships, built through decades of democratic politics and his cabinet service, made those grants obtainable on remarkably friendly terms, sometimes for payments that bore no relationship at all to what the exclusive use of a Broadway right-of-way was actually worth. Step 2. Consolidation. One by one, the competing surface lines of Manhattan were leased or absorbed into what became the Metropolitan Street Railway, until a rider could scarcely cross the island without paying a nickel to the same syndicate. The leases themselves were instruments of extraction because the holding company would guarantee a generous rental to a subsidiary line in which the insiders held stock, payable out of the revenues of the whole system, regardless of whether that line earned it. Step 3. The water. The combined system was capitalized, meaning stocks and bonds were issued against it at valuations wildly beyond the cost of the actual rails, cars, and horses. By the time the pyramid was complete, securities on the order of $260 million stood against a physical plant that investigators later valued at a fraction of that figure. The inflated portion, the press and the investigators of the era agreed, ran to the tens of millions, and some estimates ran toward 100 million. That gap between paper and steel had a name in the language of the day: watered stock. Step 4. The sale. The securities went out to the investing public, dressed in the respectability of Whitney's reform reputation, while the insiders collected construction profits through contracting companies they themselves owned, fees on every consolidation, and dividends declared on earnings the physical system could not truly support. There were years in which the Metropolitan paid a 7% dividend, while its actual operations, by later forensic accounting, were running at a loss, the difference conjured from new securities sold to new buyers. Step 5. The exit. The syndicate's money moved out of traction and into land, horses, art, and marriages years before the reckoning arrived. The reckoning did arrive. In 1905, William Randolph Hearst ran for mayor of New York on a platform that was substantially an attack on what his papers called the traction ring, and he came within a few thousand disputed ballots of winning. In 1906, the Metropolitan was folded into a merger with the new subway operator, the Interborough, a combination that layered still more paper on the pile, and in September of 1907 the Metropolitan system collapsed into receivership. The investigations that followed, including hearings before New York's brand new Public Service Commission, laid out the inflated capitalization in public for the first time, ledger by ledger. Witnesses could not explain where millions had gone. Key books, the commission was told, had been destroyed. The losses fell, where such losses generally fall, on the small shareholders who had bought the paper and on a riding public whose transit system had been financially hollowed out at the exact moment it needed capital to modernize. And William Collins Whitney faced none of it, because he had been dead for 3 years and the money had already changed its clothes. That is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it is the hinge of this entire story. The fortune crossed from its extraction phase to its reputation phase in the gap between the taking and the reckoning, and once it crossed, no court, no commission, and no newspaper could follow it. The Public Service Commission could subpoena the Metropolitan's books. It could not subpoena a stable at Saratoga, a marriage settlement, or a trust fund in a child's name. Now the 2 weddings and the war. Flora Payne Whitney died in February of 1893, and her brother Oliver, the Standard Oil treasurer, grieved her with the same intensity with which he had loved her. So when, in September of 1896, William Whitney remarried to a widow named Edith Randolph, Oliver Payne took it as a betrayal of his sister's memory, and he did something almost feudal. He went to Whitney's 4 children and, in effect, demanded they choose: side with your father and his new wife, or side with your dead mother's family and its fortune. The family split precisely down the middle. Harry Payne Whitney, the eldest son, and Dorothy, the youngest daughter, stayed with their father. Payne Whitney, the second son, who carried his uncle's very surname as a first name, and Pauline, the elder daughter, went with Oliver. The two halves of the family barely spoke for years, and the second marriage that caused all of this ended in a horror worthy of a novel. In 1898, riding to hounds near the Whitney winter estate at Aiken, South Carolina, Edith passed under a low bridge, struck her head on the span, and was left paralyzed. She died in May of 1899, not 3 years into the marriage. William Whitney himself died in February of 1904 of complications following an appendicitis operation, still estranged from 2 of his own children. That same year of the rupture, 1896, produced the other wedding, the one that wired the third great fortune into the bloodline. In August, Harry Payne Whitney married Gertrude Vanderbilt, daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the man who built the breakers at Newport, and great-granddaughter of the Commodore himself. Streetcar money, Standard Oil money, and railroad money now sat at the same breakfast table, and in 1917 the wills began to speak. Oliver Payne died that year, and his estate, estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, went overwhelmingly to the 2 children who had chosen him, above all to his namesake, Payne Whitney. The 2 who had chosen their father received, from one of the largest fortunes in America, effectively nothing. That is the will from the top of this episode, the one that punished children for loyalty to their own father, and its consequence was arithmetic. Payne Whitney, already rich, was now colossally rich, and when he died suddenly in May of 1927, playing tennis at his Long Island estate at age 51, his estate was appraised at $178,893,000 and change, at that time the largest estate ever appraised in the history of the United States. In today's money, you are somewhere north of $3 billion in a single probate filing. And here is where the family begins the conversion that makes them worth an episode. Watch what each branch does with its share, because none of them build a company with the family name on it. Payne Whitney's Money, directed by his widow Helen Hay Whitney, daughter of John Hay, who had been Abraham Lincoln's private secretary and later Secretary of State, flowed into medicine and into Yale. The Payne Whitney Gymnasium in New Haven, a Gothic tower so vast that generations of students have called it a cathedral of sweat, rose from his estate and opened in 1932. The same year, the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic opened inside New York Hospital, funded by a bequest of several $1 million from his will, and it became for decades the most famous psychiatric facility in America. The place where, in 1961, Marilyn Monroe was briefly and miserably confined. Notice the pattern forming. The name goes on the gymnasium and the clinic. The name never went on the streetcar holding company or the Standard Oil dividend checks that funded them. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney ran the same conversion in art. She was a serious sculptor in her own right, working out of a studio in Greenwich Village. And starting around 1914, she began buying the work of living American painters at a time when the American art establishment considered living American painters barely worth wall space. By 1929, she had accumulated roughly 500 works. Artists like Edward Hopper, John Sloan, and the urban realists the critics sneered at as the Ashcan School, and she offered the entire collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a gift, reportedly with money attached to house it. The Metropolitan refused. Its director declined the collection essentially on sight. So Gertrude founded her own museum, and in November of 1931 the Whitney Museum of American Art opened on West 8th Street, with her lieutenant Juliana Force as its first director. Think about the second-order effect of that rejection. Because the Met said no, American art got a dedicated institution whose entire mandate was the art the establishment ignored. And that institution, today housed in a Renzo Piano building in the Meatpacking District that opened in 2015, now defines the mainstream it was founded outside of. The Whitney Biennial, the exhibition that critics love to hate and artists need to be in, is that 1896 wedding, still compounding. Even Dorothy, the daughter who stayed with her father and was cut off by her uncle, ran the playbook. With her husband Willard Straight, she put up the money in 1914 to found The New Republic, a magazine of ideas that has been shaping American political argument for over a century, and her Whitney inheritance quietly underwrote it for decades. Which brings us to the grandsons and to February of 1946. John Hay Whitney, called Jock, was Payne Whitney's son, heir through his father to the Standard Oil half of the fortune, and named for his grandfather, the Secretary of State. His cousin, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, called Sonny, was Harry and Gertrude's son, heir to the streetcar and Vanderbilt half. In the late 1920s, Sonny put money behind a Yale friend named Juan Tripp, who wanted to fly airmail from Key West to Havana, became the young airline's largest early backer and its board chairman, and that company became Pan American Airways, which is why the family name sits in Pan Am's early ownership papers. In the 30s, the cousins together bought a large stake, roughly 15%, in a struggling color film company called Technicolor, then founded Pioneer Pictures to force Hollywood to use it. And Jock went further. He put his money behind David Selznick, became chairman of Selznick International Pictures, and financed the purchase of the rights to a first novel by an Atlanta newspaperwoman named Margaret Mitchell for $50,000, a record price for a debut. The novel was gone with the wind. The film returned its investors many times over, and Jock Whitney's name appears nowhere on the screen where a casual viewer would notice it. During the war, he served in intelligence, was captured by the Germans in southern France in August of 1944, and escaped by jumping from a moving prison train. He came home having concluded, he later said, that inherited money sitting in bonds was money abdicating its responsibility. So in February of 1946, he opened J.H. Whitney and Company with $10 million of his own capital and a hired staff of professionals led by a young Texan named Benno Schmidt. And here is the birth certificate moment from the top of this episode. The firm needed a name for what it did, which was buying meaningful stakes in brand new, unproven companies, the kind of thing banks would not touch. The phrase floating around the office was private adventure capital. Schmidt, by his own later account, suggested compressing it, and the firm began describing its business as venture capital. Two words, coined as a piece of internal vocabulary in a family office, now the label on a global industry that deploys hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The same year, up in Boston, George Doriot founded American Research and Development, the first publicly funded venture firm. So 1946 gave the industry both of its founding models, public fund and private family capital. But the name itself came out of the Whitney office, and the first famous win came in a can. During the war, government research had produced a process for concentrating orange juice into powder for the army, and a Florida company had built capacity against a military order that evaporated the moment Japan surrendered. The Whitney firm backed the pivot, funding a businessman named John Fox to sell the intermediate product, frozen concentrate, directly to consumers. The company became Minute Maid. It nearly died more than once. It famously paid Bing Crosby partly in stock to sing for it on the radio, and in 1960 Coca-Cola bought it outright. The frozen orange juice in your grocer's freezer is Manhattan streetcar water and Standard Oil dividends, 3 transformations downstream. Jock himself went on to serve as Eisenhower's ambassador to Great Britain and to buy the New York Herald Tribune. And Benno Schmidt went on to chair the panel that designed Nixon's war on cancer. The family office kept minting establishment figures long after it stopped needing to mint money. So let us lay the playbook flat, because you were promised the moves, and there are 5. Move 1, bank reputation before you bank money. Whitney spent the 1870s prosecuting the Tweed frauds precisely because visible cleanliness is the asset that makes everything later possible. Move 2. Stand in the doorway between public authority and private capital, because franchises, contracts, and regulatory grants are where paper value is conjured. Whether the asset is a Broadway streetcar franchise in 1886 or, if you care to extend the thought, a Spectrum license or a drug approval today. Move 3. Exit before the reckoning and let the losses land on the diffuse public, small shareholders and strafangers who have no mechanism to follow the money once it changes form. Move 4, and this is the one the Vanderbilts never learned, put the name only on the giving side of the ledger. There was never a Whitney traction tower or a Whitney and Payne oil company for a muckraker to photograph. There is a Whitney museum, a Payne Whitney gymnasium, a Payne Whitney clinic. The extraction was anonymous and the philanthropy was signed. which means every public trace of the name is attached to generosity, and public memory, given a century, keeps only the signatures. And move 5, when you invent a new way to deploy the money, name it yourself in neutral, technical language so that within a generation, the practice sounds not like a family's scheme, but like a natural feature of the economy. Venture capital sounds like weather. It was a letterhead. The second-order implication is the uncomfortable one, and I will leave you to weigh it. The fortune itself is largely gone, divided, taxed, spent, and dispersed across dozens of heirs. The power is not because the power was never really the money. It was the museum that decides which American artists matter, the clinic that defined psychiatric care, the industry structure through which nearly every technology company you use was financed. The Whitneys converted a fortune into infrastructure for reputation, and infrastructure does not appear in probate. If this episode changed what you see when you walk past a museum with a family name over the door, subscribe, because this series does one forgotten fortune at a time, and hit like so. The algorithm shows this one to somebody else who thinks venture capital is just a phrase. See you in the next one.